Welcome everybody to the 42nd episode of Comic DNA, on which we will be discussing Daredevil Born Again by Frank Miller and David Mazzucchelli, first published by Marvel Comics in 1986. I am Aaron Walther, and with me today is my special guest, Jordan Alsaqa. Jordan, did I pronounce your name correctly?
You did, and that is impressive because I've heard it so many different ways.
You know what? I'll tell you this, the only reason I know how to pronounce your name is because I watched your Kickstarter video where you introduced yourself. And,
that probably helps.
And I was like, I'll just pronounce it however he pronounces it. So, Jordan and I, we met last year at Heroes Con in North Carolina, and he was very polite and very nice, and he asked me to share all of my comic writing secrets. And 30 seconds later, he was filled with all the wisdom I could give him. And then I imagine you probably talked to some other people who offer better advice, and I believe, if I'm mistaken, please correct me. You set out to work on producing your first comic. Is this correct? All right.
First major thing. I've drawn as poorly as I draw. I have drawn comics and done it for myself for years, but yeah, this is the first time I'm trying to put something out there.
All right, cool. And so that's a book called Terminal Protocol, which is currently being funded right now, this very second, on Kickstarter.
Yeah,
so,
so as of, I guess this is coming out Wednesday-ish, based on what Aaron said, so probably about a week left. Terminal Protocol is a story I wrote a few years ago for an anthology that unfortunately fell apart. But
I've been there.
But I edited it so much because the editor was really helpful, and we put a lot of work into it, so I didn't want to fully abandon it. And then I decided when I had the funds to kind of find an artist and start working, this is the one. It's a sci-fi story about artificial intelligence and robotics, and it's just about a husband and wife. The husband comes down with a terminal illness, and as opposed that there's no scientific treatment currently available, but the wife, being an expert of artificial intelligence and robotics that she is, decides to do all she can to try and save him. Whether or not that ends up being a good idea, or if she can fully go through with it, or what he's going to lose in the process, those are all kind of the questions that the story deals with. But that is something that I was really excited to tell the story of. I love robotics. Sci-fi I'm a huge fan of, and just getting to start working on a project at all is very intimidating because getting into the creative space, there's so much to consider that you learn about kind of at the independent level. You just learn as you're running. You're constantly figuring things out.
I've always said that, the only way to learn how to make a comic is to just make a comic, and you'll figure it out. You either will or you won't. Either the comic gets made or it won't get made.
Yeah. But we're doing well. We're at 63% as of recording, and I'm hoping that's up in a few days. But the artist, Rembrew, that I'm working with is great. He's been in comics for a few years now. He'll do, if you go check out the campaign, you can see the video. We have sketches, art prints, a bunch of podcasts that are going out to every backer. I'm also the co-host of the Joy of Gaming / Joy of Comics podcast. So my crew there has agreed to do a bunch of sci-fi film reviews based on the number of backers we get. We're pretty close to having our third one unlocked, so I'm feeling safe to say that if you back the project, that's 3 sci-fi film reviews, and that's just at any level. But whatever level, if you guys would be interested, I'm pretty proud of the work. And if you just check it out, the full 6-page prologue is on the Kickstarter page, so you can just sort of see what the story is about.
Yeah, it looks really good. I'm backing this project, Jordan's comic, because it looks awesome. Like the artist, you said, Rem is his name?
Rem, yeah.
Rem, man, he's great. Really good. I was immediately drawn in just from the art. I'm sure it's going to be a really well written comic too. But
no, comics is art.
It's art, yeah. I know.
Looking good is very important. I mean, when I was just sort of looking for artists and he was interested at all, I was like, I've done nothing. I don't know why you want to work with me. You look fantastic.
Yeah.
But thank you.
I was at a comic convention one time, and somebody was looking through my stuff, and they were very nice and very, very, very positive, and they bought some comics, and they said, I forget which one they were looking at, but they said, wow, this is like a really professional looking book. Like these artists are all really good. Like you work with good artists. That's how I know you're a good writer. And I was like, well, okay. There's some logic there. I can get behind that because, like you said, comics is visual, comics is art, and I've also kind of always maintained that a lot of comic writers, their quality of writing varies depending on the artist that they're working with.
Yeah,
You know,
I mean,
just yeah,
the artist can bring a lot out of the script that, as a writer, you don't even think about.
right.
And they can add so many flourishes, and when you see the completed page, you're just going, "Was this my script originally?
Yeah,
I
yeah.
almost can't believe it."
Yeah, there's I guess that's just that magic of it being a collaborative medium, But there's
Yeah,
like I mean, you can even go back to like Watchmen by Alan Moore and Dave Gibbons, and there's a lot of credit that Alan Moore gets. I mean, obviously Alan Moore's a great writer; he's one of my biggest influences. But there's a lot of credit he gets on that book for being really clever, and then you read the behind the scenes stuff, and a lot of it was Dave Gibbons' idea, like when he was coming up with the art. I'm not saying it was a collaborative effort. They both worked and they both made a beautiful, brilliant comic. But a lot of people just try to break it down into typist and drawer,
No, I mean, if you're gonna make something good, you work together. Like, because the prologue that we did wasn't originally written because it didn't need a prologue. It was just going to be an anthology before we expanded it. But just talking with Rem and seeing what he was excited about when I wrote the prologue, the second page is this big splash of all these different robot designs. And I wrote that in there because he was super excited about getting to design robots for this world, and I figured, well, why not have a showcase for that? And
Absolutely, yeah.
That's the back and forth.
Yeah, it's really cool. Talking about that, that actually ties into this book that we're talking about, Daredevil Born Again. Because, as I said in the intro, it's written by Frank Miller, who is, Frank Miller really, he doesn't need any introduction to, I think, anybody who's read comics in passing in the last 30 years probably knows who Frank Miller is. But he's, pretty famous for the books that he's written and drawn.
Mm-hmm.
His run on Daredevil specifically, Batman, Dark Knight Returns, Sin City, even, 300, and you start getting into his later books. But I think that Daredevil Born Again is probably one of the best books he's ever written, and I don't think it's a coincidence that it's because he doesn't draw it. I'm not saying Frank Miller's a bad artist. I am saying that David Mazzucchelli is a better artist.
I can agree with that. What really struck me, because I read this years ago. This is one of those arcs that when you're getting into comics, it's like if you want to read the big two.
Yeah, it's always in the top 10 list of great comics.
Yeah, it's like start here.
Yeah.
And so I'd read it before, and the art is great. It looks like from the 80s, but it's still just so clean lines, so clarity of the different characters. And yeah, it just does a great job of telling the story. I enjoy Frank Miller, a lot of his earlier work, but yeah, the art in this is stellar.
Yeah, and I read an interesting thing when I was kind of doing some research, getting ready to talk about this book, that apparently Frank Miller agreed to do this book on the condition that David Mazzucchelli would work off of a full script. Meaning, if for those of you that don't know the difference, traditionally, especially I think around the time in the 80s, that Marvel was still working on the Marvel style, or the basic way the comic scripts would be written is the writer would come up with like a plot synopsis for the issue, write out. It could range from just a few paragraphs to a couple of pages of of detail of just what happens, and then the artist takes it and breaks it all down into panels and fills out the issue with all the little interactions. Then they give it back to the writer, and the writer writes all the dialogue and the narration. But Frank Miller was very strict, I guess, on wanting to work from a full script, where he would write everything out, all the panel breakdowns, the descriptions, which is how most comics are written today.
Yeah.
That's actually how most of them were written before Stan Lee and Jack Kirby in the 60s, too. Like, there was just sort of like this brief period where Marvel got really popular, and that was the style. Mostly because, there were so many great artists working at Marvel that could do that, and Stan Lee was the only writer, so...
Yeah.
But, anyway, I digress. Anyway, the point is, so this is a book that's definitely like Frank Miller's vision. Like he was, he's a guy who has been, at the point that this comic was made, he had already pretty much become pretty big in the comic book industry. and he's used to writing and drawing, so he's used to having that level of control over the way the book looks. But I still maintain that we talked about Mazzucchelli just a few episodes ago on our episode about Asterios Polyp, and I mean, if you want to hear me gush about an artist, that's one of them. I mean, Mazzucchelli is an artist with a capital A. This guy knows art, and he knows comic art too, and
Yeah,
I just think that like there's just a level of just the craft of the way everything is depicted. There's such detail, and it's so clean and easy to read and easy to see.
he knows how to tell the story, and it's interesting you say that about the full script because not that I would have thought of it being written in the Marvel manner, but when I think Frank Miller, it feels like what would fit that sort of storytelling just because he is so narration heavy that it seems like he can get around the artist having freedom. So it's interesting to hear.
I was just going to bring that up because so much of this book, Born Again, and I mean it is Frank Miller's style, but it's on display in this book is that it's like you said, it's very narration heavy. He really likes his third person classic pulp narration, and that's a really like I've actually been trying to experiment with that myself in some stuff that I'm working on, and that's a really great way to sort of get around like within the Marvel style, like what you're saying. By having that narration, the artist can just sort of draw whatever he wants, and the narration is the glue that will just sort of link it all together and keep it flowing in a certain way.
Yeah, and there are scenes in this book where it definitely feels like, I mean, again, just it's surprising to hear it was so heavily scripted just because there are scenes like when Matt is recovering in the church, or you've got the scenes of Karen trying to get back to America, where the art tells the story really on its own. If you had a lot of these scenes without any narration, they could stand on their own, but the narration adds a lot of the psychological stuff, but it doesn't necessarily connect to what's happening as directly.
Right, yeah. That's actually one of my favorite things about comics is like this level of dual narrative, how visually you can be telling one story and then the textually you can be telling an entirely different story or just another layer of the story. You can really do all kinds of things with it. And that's one of the things I like about Daredevil Born Again and Frank Miller's early work is that he really makes good use of that.
Yeah, and I've read a lot of Frank Miller, and there are some times where I feel like he can get a little heavy-handed with the prose.
Oh, certainly. I think almost any writer who indulges in like narration in comics there's going to be a point where they get a little heavy-handed.
Yeah, but I think it works really well for this story and the way it's told. That I never, as I was rereading it for this podcast, it didn't ever jump out as me as being in the way. I think it really married well.
Yeah, I agree. It's even compared to like a lot of Frank Miller's other stuff, I think this is pretty clean.
Yeah.
So I guess, we've kind of been going off on the style. For anybody that may not have read this book, and this is certainly, like as we said, this is certainly one of those top tier, like top. It's always on a top 10 list of. Well, it's certainly considered one of the best Daredevil stories, but. This is usually a lot of, like, if you want to get into the characters, this is one of the stories that's always referenced. But for anybody that may not have read it, I'm going to do a quick plot synopsis, just to kind of give everybody an idea of what we're talking about when we talk about this book. So, in the Born Again story, Wilson Fisk, the Kingpin of crime, discovers Daredevil's true identity, that of blind lawyer Matt Murdock. The Kingpin uses his influence to systematically destroy Daredevil's life. Matt Murdock is framed for bribing witnesses, he loses his right to practice law, he has his assets frozen by the IRS, and then to top it all off, his house gets blown up. Unrelated to the Kingpin's machinations, Matt Murdock's girlfriend breaks up with him and starts dating his best friend, Foggy Nelson. So Murdock is now destitute and friendless, and he descends into madness. After being nursed back to health by nuns in a Catholic mission, he begins to rebuild himself and starts to fight back against the Kingpin. I think one of the interesting things about this story, I think one of the reasons I really like it, is that there's a lot of moving pieces. There's a lot of characters. It really doesn't feel like a Daredevil story per se. It's really got like I think Frank Miller, and this is what Frank Miller's style. He really likes this, but it really does have a nice classic film noir pulp where there's like a lot of stuff going around. Like the city is the character, and it's all just kind of centered around this one kind of main character. And I think that's what we're seeing in Daredevil Born Again.
Definitely, because what's interesting about it is you could make this just about if Matt Murdock if it was completely unrelated to Daredevil, he was just a lawyer that had gotten on the wrong side of a mob boss, and the mob boss did everything he could to systematically destroy his world, because Daredevil doesn't feature as a superhero, like costumed identity, doesn't feature into a whole lot of the story. I mean, he spends a long part of it.
He's barely
a homeless dude.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah. He's mostly Matt Murdock for the comic. Like you said, like Daredevil really, and this is kind of part of, again, with the whole themes of this story, Born Again. Daredevil is at the beginning of the story. He's Daredevil. Then Matt Murdock's life is destroyed, and then he eventually comes back. But really, like you said, there's not a lot of Daredevil in this comic. And go ahead.
Well. I mean, and yeah, it's interesting because when I was reading, I was doing a little research and saw that like the last two issues that were sort of like also ended up being considered part of Born Again. That's where it gets a little more to the traditional superheroing and kind of plays a little weird, which I'm sure we'll talk to when we get more towards the end of the book. But that's where Daredevil shows up. But for the main 5 issues, it really is just about sort of, death and rebirth for the character.
Exactly. Yeah. And it's kind of interesting how the story is sort of there's a detachment to Matt Murdock. Like Frank Miller really likes playing in stereotypes, or I shouldn't say stereotypes, I mean like archetypes. Yeah, he really likes playing in archetypes. The prose gives you just what you need to know about what's going on without feeling too intimate. Like it really tries to just give you like a flat look at Matt Murdock going crazy. And, yeah. I guess that's how I would put it.
No, I agree, and I think like a lot of I think the best arcs in comics, or at least in Big 2 comics, are ones where you can come in knowing, even if you know nothing about the character, it sets up who they are at this moment in their career, and then does the exploration, and whether or not it gives it necessarily a bow at the end, you can get a complete story and a complete character study just within that one arc. And this one definitely does that. I mean, from the beginning, it shows where Murdock is in his life right now, and you can see, you just see everything starting to crumble, and it happens so fast over the course of that first issue.
Yeah, I definitely agree. I would actually say that's one of the interesting things about this comic, and this was one of the things I was gonna bring up. It's always hard for me when I try to like rate a story arc. Like how do you judge it and how do you qualify it? Because like this is obviously voted as one of the best. Like this is definitely, I mean, it's one of my favorite Daredevil comics ever. Like it's hands down, I think it's one of the best ones. But, and this is where there's a little caveat, is it's really good, but it only in that it works in conjunction with other Daredevil stories. Like at a certain level of this story, it requires you to have a certain understanding or intimacy with the character. Like the story doesn't spend a lot of time on Daredevil being a hero, because it's like the first issue starts and it's Daredevil being destroyed. So you just sort of have to, you go into it understanding that Daredevil is a superhero and that this is a story about a superhero being destroyed. I will agree that it's sort of inconsequential, like how much time they spent on Daredevil being a superhero, because the story is a superhero's life being destroyed. But I do think that it's one of those books that, or I should say, it's one of these stories that's really, really good because you read it after getting all of these other stories about him being a superhero and always winning, and then you get this really hardcore tragedy. And I mean, he comes back from it, but it's part of the reason it's really good is because it's in contrast and in conjunction with other books.
I can see that perspective. I think for me, what's interesting is this is one of the earliest Daredevil stories I've read, and the Frank Miller era is really what sent his life, kind of ironically, given that the ending of this story is so hopeful.
Yeah.
For the next 20, 25 years, it's nothing but crap from Matt Murdock. So there's almost an element of, nowadays, if you know the character, either from comics or from like the Netflix show, you almost expect his life to be this terrible. And so maybe that's what, coming at it from that perspective, made it seem like, okay, this is just who Daredevil is, because it would become the template for who Daredevil was for the next 25 years until the Mark Waid run.
Yeah, I mean, Frank Miller definitely set the standard. Like you said, that became the template of Matt Murdock and Daredevil, and his life just always being like ready to crumble at any time. And always being a character that's kind of on the brink, like he walks a knife's edge, like he's always on the brink of kind of going insane. That seems to be the cycle with the character. But it wasn't always that. It wasn't always the case. That was definitely Frank Miller's influence on the series.
Yeah. And it's just interesting just because I mean I know that academically, I know that Daredevil back in Stan Lee, the early days,
sure,
was a bit more swashbuckling, but like I wasn't the biggest Daredevil fan probably until this year. Big surprise! I spent a lot of time reading the Brubaker run and the Bendis run.
Oh sure,
and the Mark Waid run, which is more fun. But watching the Netflix show, so it's hard to think of him, especially also seeing him in other appearances in other Marvel books where he can tend to come across as a bit more dour. So it's hard to fully appreciate that contrast as it would have been back then.
Well, and I think it's also, I mean, you're also kind of getting into an element about how these characters are living mythologies, and as the stories are being told, the mythology, like the greater mythology about the character, is sort of being crafted, and they are all in relation to each other. So if you've got the Marvel Universe where you've got Spider-Man and the X-Men and Fantastic Four and Daredevil, and if Daredevil is like Spider-Man but he's not funny, but that's like he doesn't make jokes the way Spider-Man does, that's the only difference. But if you then try something and you kind of add this pulp noir layer and you make him a little darker, it makes him stand out a little bit more against Spider-Man, and it kind of gives him just that his mythology like a greater uniqueness. And and it just sort of like, it's just the way these stories naturally gravitate, is that not just fans but creators, everybody just kind of latches onto the one thing that works with this character and his mythology that won't necessarily work with another character. So I think it's perfectly natural for Daredevil to kind of develop into this like you said, like this dour, kind of darker, grittier superhero.
Yeah, and it's something that I enjoy those stories. I enjoyed the Mark Waid run, and I'm looking forward to see what Charles Soule does now that it seems like he's taking him back in that gritty direction. Just because
it's only a matter of time.
Yeah, well, I think the Marvel Universe needs that hero, and without Daredevil, I mean, there's Punisher and maybe like Black Widow, but they tend to have, well, Black Widow especially tends to have bigger spy-related adventures, and Punisher's just, there's no happiness in his life.
Right.
So I think Daredevil gets a better balance of having hope.
Yeah, and I think that works really well, too. Like, just talking about the mythology of the character. There is an appeal to this light and dark version of a superhero. And I really like a lot of the symbolism that we see in Born Again. All this like, specifically Catholic, but a lot of Christian symbolism that's in the book. And I think that works really well for a character like Daredevil. That's... like you can apply symbolism to pretty much any character, but it's just, again, talking about how these mythologies evolve, like it just works so perfectly with a character like Daredevil. Like he's got that, the darkness in him, but then there's also this level of good and hope, and they're always kind of at contrast with each other. And that's just a classic good versus evil thing, which really applies itself really well to like the imagery and the symbolism of like a Catholic church.
No, I would definitely agree. And again, kind of going to where Daredevil would end up for the majority of his career now is that it kind of symbolizes, at a very basic level, it's that idea of Catholic guilt. No matter what he may try to do to get happy, it's always kind of gnawing at him, and there's always going to be this. In his case, it becomes, physically manifested in the villains and the hardships he faces that is going to keep him from ever truly feeling satisfied.
Yeah, it's good. I think it's a fun mythology. Like, it's a fun character. I like talking about, like, you've just been reading Daredevil, like, this year, you said. So you've mostly read a lot of, like, the newer stuff?
Well, I've read, I started, a few years ago when the Mark Waid run started, because it was such a radically different, here's a new jumping on point.
Sure.
I started reading that then. But yeah, the Bendis run, basically straight through to where Mark Waid took over, that's what I've been reading through this past year.
Okay, yeah. It's kind of weird. I don't want to, like, go out of my way to, like, say I'm, like, a huge Daredevil fan or a fanboy or anything like that. I do really like Daredevil, and I have read a lot of Daredevil comics. I have pretty much, like, from Frank Miller's run up until, like, throughout all the 80s, up until the 90s when Marvel just, like, got terrible and went bankrupt, and he, like, changed his costume, like, it was, like, black with armor and stuff. It was a mess. So I like, had all of that, and then I started reading it again when they restarted it again with the Marvel Knights line, with Kevin Smith and Quesada was drawing the first issue.
Right.
And then eventually, they did the David Mack issues, and then Brian Michael Bendis took over. So I got all of that run too, right up until they did the Shadowland big event, and they kind of, like, I forget what they did with it. I was out. I was checked out at that point. Like, I
actually, Shadowland is where he like takes over.
He takes over the Kingpin.
He does that during he does that during Bendis' run, but during Shadowland he literally gets possessed by a devil.
Right, yeah.
And yeah, it's kind of weird.
I like I said, that was it for me. Like, it also coincides with, I've talked about this a few times on other episodes. It also coincides with the time of my life when I just stopped kind of buying regular monthly comics because I just don't have the expendable funds for it anymore. But
yeah,
it just, like, I did start reading Mark Waid and Chris Samnee's issues because I'm a big fan of both of those creators. They're both just really, really good guys. Really, really, just, like, you can always count on them to deliver pro work. And I did like Mark Waid's swashbuckling Daredevil. I only have, like, the first 2 trades. I stopped buying issues. I've only got, like, the first couple of trades of it. But it's good stuff. I need to read the rest of it.
Yeah, and I think what's good about it, especially later on, is without going, full noir dark, it does bring more of that traditional dark times in Matt's life. It just is able to do it from a more accessible, enjoyable perspective, I guess.
Sure.
Because Daredevil, at his worst, can get very maudlin and depressing.
Yeah, and that's always, like, a danger, because you don't... It's always dangerous to go too far in that direction, because then it just stops being fun. I mean, it's a superhero comic. Has to be a level of fun. I mean, that's my opinion. I just think that superheroes generally are... They basically operate as morality tales. So there has to be a level of like, identification, like the reader has to identify and have some sort of entertainment to it. But that's kind of me just kind of getting way out there on.
No, I think there's merit to that. I mean, you read comic books because you want to enjoy them.
Right.
And so I think, it's important that they are enjoyable to read, and like, my biggest character is Spider-Man, and I can't read for the life of me. I have them because I have so many Spider-Man books, but I have all the Todd McFarlane run, and that gets way too dark to be enjoyable. Like, it is just miserable. And not to say that the art is bad or that it couldn't work in a different context, but with Spider-Man in particular, it's just such a dark, grim saga that it's like, you don't want to keep reading. It's so oppressive.
My general policy with this podcast is I really, really try to be mostly positive. I will occasionally get into... I mean, if I have... criticism is criticism, but, like, I try to keep it, I try to keep it pretty positive. But those Todd McFarlane Spider-Man issues, ugh. Todd McFarlane is not a writer. He is an artist who is not great with anatomy, but he's got style. But he is not a writer. And those comics are what you get when artists think they can write. There, I said it.
Yeah, I mean they're also very a relic of the '90s.
Oh, absolutely.
Which you know, a lot of books tend to be relics of their age. But what I liked about this Daredevil book is it felt real. It didn't feel aged.
I agree.
Very modern. It read like a book that could have come out just last week. Yeah, it's and a lot of that is it feels like that noir book, and I think noir books always kind of carry that heavy narration, introspection to it. But it helps this be a timeless tale that you can read without being like, because a lot of people will be like, old comics, I don't want to read that. They're so wordy. They just haven't aged well. This one has, and I think that's awesome.
It has. No, there's definitely a timeless quality to Born Again, and I think I would actually go so far as to say that timeless quality probably is in part due to sort of the detached nature of the narration. You know, there's really not a lot of continuity in this book. You know, it's pretty self-contained in what it's about. All the characters are operating as archetypes, so like you don't really need to know exactly what's going on with Foggy Nelson in the continuity of the book. Like you don't need to know about him. Like you don't need him getting married and getting a divorce doesn't really matter in like to the plot. All you need to know is that it happened, and it's all spelled out very clearly in the book. Same thing with like Karen Page. Like you don't need to read the issues where Daredevil and Karen Page, you know, were a thing. All you need to know is that she's an ex-girlfriend and now she's back. And it just works really well.
It does. And at a larger level, it feels like again, kind of like the Netflix show for Daredevil, it feels very detached and its own universe. To the point where when Captain America and the Avengers show up, it's almost jarring how suddenly, oh right, this takes place in the Marvel universe.
Is, yeah. Oh, there are other characters. Like Iron Man and Thor are just kind of there for like 3 panels, you know?
Yeah.
Which I guess, talking about continuity, that's like one little bit of continuity that I won't use this as a mark against the book, but talk about the timelessness of the book. If you just have not really read a lot of comics and you like all the movies, and then you heard this is a good comic, so you read it, you might be reading it and being like, why does Iron Man look so weird?
It's a very old armor.
It's the 80s period where he was wearing silver and red armor. But, you know, other than that, that's still pretty minuscule. I mean, Iron Man, you pretty much, it's not quite the same as, it's not quite as drastic a costume change as I've seen others.
No, and it's not like he came in talking about what's going on in his book, which a lot of books will do, is have, you know, go buy Iron Man.
Exactly.
There's none of that here. It's not like go buy the Avengers. It's just they are the top cops in this world, and they show up when someone starts shooting up Manhattan.
Exactly. Again, it's their archetype. They're just filling the role that they play in the greater mythology.
Yeah.
And that's, again, that's the whole timelessness of the book. I think that's definitely part of it. I also think one of the things I was going to also talk about, we're talking about this detached level and how there's a lot of different stories going on. And like we haven't really brought up the character of Ben Ulrich, Daredevil's friend and reporter, who is in many ways almost really the main character, or feels like he could have been the main character for this book.
Yeah, definitely. And you know, later arcs by other writers will, you know, very straight put him as the main character.
Right.
Where Daredevil won't even show up for several issues.
Exactly, yeah. But one of the things I always thought was interesting about Born Again is how this story is basically Daredevil has his life destroyed, as we established, and then he kind of goes crazy, and then he kind of puts himself back together and goes to fight, you know, like defend himself against the Kingpin. But there's kind of this, what I really like about it is there's a point, there's a point in this story where Daredevil couldn't necessarily have done anything to fix anything. Like, one man by himself, he could not have done anything. But the true, like, what really, like, puts it over the top is the big scene Essentially, it's mistakes made by Fisk or his organization that lead to his downfall. Because you have that big scene where you have all the people that are intimidating Ben Ulrich. They kill the crooked cop, and they're trying to threaten him. And then the nurse, the big nurse who like broke his fingers, she goes to attack him in his home. If she hadn't done that, if she had done what the Kingpin said, they wouldn't have caught her, and that wouldn't have led to finding out about all the cops, getting all this footage of all this stuff, Daredevil showing up and having somebody to punch to feel good about himself. Like,
Yeah.
there's kind of there's this level of like it really was sort of like the people in the Kingpin's organization were undermining him, and I guess what I like about this is there's this level of like ambiguity to like whether or not good will triumph over evil, and it's just sort of this is why it appeals to me, because it's just sort of like a collection of random and chaotic people all making mistakes, and Daredevil is able to use that to his advantage eventually.
Yeah, what I like is what all of that chaos though is when you have Kingpin, for the most part, like throughout the story, he takes on this role of being extremely competent, and he won't let anyone talk back to him. He's super efficient. He'll buy you out and break your legs, and he's done with you.
Yes.
But it's like when it comes to Daredevil and Matt Murdock, he can't help himself almost, because there's so many moments where you can see where if he just shot him, or if he just got rid of him, or if he did all of these small things,
Yep.
but he's so consumed with like not just beating Daredevil, but doing it in a way that shows he's better than Matt.
Well, yeah,
That
yeah.
he keeps letting himself get defeated, and it's believable because everyone else that works for the Kingpin, he already knows he's better than them.
Well, it's all about breaking Daredevil. It's not about killing Daredevil. And yeah, that's Kingpin's his own weakness, is that he's so in control of everything. But ego is a hell of a thing, and he gets so obsessive about Matt Murdock and people that would stand up against him because he's used to just having his way and bulldozing over any competition. And yeah, it becomes like almost like a philosophical point that he's trying to make against Daredevil. And yeah, that's eventually what led to his downfall, I guess you could say.
Yeah, that and his what I like is just the way he refuses not to kind of sign the calling card, and how Matt keeps figuring out, because if he there are moments again where it's like if he hadn't blown up Matt's place, Matt really just might have legitimately lost it.
Yes,
completely.
exactly.
But Kingpin gave him this, because he had to let Matt know it was him almost. He gave Matt the one escape rope out of his insanity.
Yeah, that's what I was going to mention earlier. I was talking about the nurse character that was disobeying orders. Yeah, there's all these little moments where it's all these little mistakes that the Kingpin is making that is giving Matt all that he needs to fight back. So the Kingpin's not as perfect as he thinks he is.
Definitely not.
I mean, that's just the way things go. Like so many times, like so many criminals, they get caught because they make mistakes. People make mistakes. That's you leave evidence. You think you don't, but you do. And that's just it's again, I don't want to keep going back to this word, but it's a big chaotic world out there, and it's so hard to control everything.
Yeah, and what's interesting, kind of going back to reading this, because where I started with the Bendis run is where his identity gets out publicly.
Right.
But there's the big element of Kingpin's known for years who Daredevil is, and reading this, it's like it almost feels like after this, Kingpin feels like he lost, and he refuses to let himself try it again. He has to beat him some other way now. Moving forward, anyway.
Yeah, I mean that's even another. Like, if Kingpin really wanted to destroy Daredevil, once he got his identity, he shouldn't have kept it to himself. You know what I mean? But it became a personal quest of his. And that, again, obsession. And it'll ruin you.
Yeah, it can. So as far as the one thing I found interesting was the way that it intercuts, and because there's a lot of, when I think of comics, or at least starting out as a writer, there are the rules that you don't break, and a lot of them tend to talk about, setting the scene and not, and staying in a scene and keeping it. But in this, there are a lot of scenes where it will cut before all 3 or 4 storylines going on. It'll jump for one panel with Karen, and then jump over to Foggy and Glory, and then it'll go to Ben, and it just, I think it adds to that chaos. Just
Absolutely.
That sense that stories all happening at the same time as everyone's kind of spiraling out of control.
And there's so much individual narration. Like there's the Ben Ulrich narration, which is done in first person, and then there's like the third person narration when it's just the author Frank Miller talking about Daredevil's life. There's a lot of like. Like just kind of like what you're saying with this intercutting. There's a lot of disparate stories and storytelling, all kind of swirled together, happening. All like it's almost just like a mishmash.
Yeah. And it's because time gets brought up a few times. It's not that the story doesn't take place over that long a time period, or at least from when he's disbarred, because I think there's like it mentions that it's a long battle and then he loses, but then by the end of it, it's only been about 2 weeks.
Yeah, it's just a couple of weeks.
They call that out.
Like once the house gets blown up, because there's this period. Yeah, there's like a period where it's like a few issues later, and Matt is kind of going insane, or he's gone insane, and Foggy says something like, "Matt's been missing for 2 days," and I was like, "Oh, 2 days, like." The 2 issues,
It's a busy 2 days.
Well, there's a lot to cover. There's a lot of stuff going on.
Yeah.
But yeah. Have you read Frank Miller's other Daredevil books?
I know I've read at least one other but again, it's been a while, just because I read a lot of those big storylines when I was first getting into comics, and that was probably about a decade ago that I really started. But I'm curious, because I didn't exactly see whereabout in Frank's run was this.
This actually was after Frank Miller's run.
So this was
a few years.
Swan song?
Yeah. Well, basically what happened was he had been drawing Daredevil for a while, and then the writer left the book, and they let Frank Miller write it also. And that was when he did a couple of years. He did a couple of years on Daredevil as the writer-artist. And that's when he did the big Elektra story arc and Bullseye and all these big things. Then he left the book, and Denny O'Neil had a few years of a run. And then Denny O'Neil was leaving, and they asked Frank Miller to come back to kind of do this like big. I guess you could say it was a swan song, like just another arc. And so this was, I think it definitely operates as like Frank Miller's like Daredevil opus almost. But it's just interesting because it doesn't have a lot of the elements from his first longer run, like all of the Elektra and Bullseye stuff, which I really kind of like because it makes it. It's really just about Daredevil and the Kingpin. And really...
Well, that's what's interesting about it, because I think, when I think Frank Miller Daredevil, I think Bullseye Elektra.
Exactly.
And that storyline. But this is just as important and influential. It's not as bombastic.
Yeah.
Would probably be the best way to put it.
Well, because, when you get into the Elektra and Bullseye stuff, that's where you're kind of getting into traditional superheroes. So it's just... Yeah. Daredevil's a superhero. He's fighting bad guys. Elektra is sort of like this ambiguous in between. She's also, fighting. It's all fighting. There's not any like superheroics going on in Born Again. Like it's all just like it's just true crime, political drama basically. And it's Matt Murdock. It's an internal struggle that he's dealing with, not an external struggle. And a lot of Oh, go ahead.
Well, because they go out of their way to say almost that this is not a traditional superhero story, because there's a scene after Karen and Matt reunite, where she's just curious why he's not putting on the suit and jumping around the streets.
Right.
And he's almost a god then, but he doesn't want to be that guy right now.
Right, exactly. And I think that's also contributes to like this timelessness of this story, is because it really it's really just like it doesn't have any of the trappings of a superhero comic. It really is just a film noir story with just little bits of superhero window dressing here and there.
Yeah, and it's a really good story, and I think that's why I give a little of the, especially knowing that it's a 2-part epilogue to those last 2 issues, because I think that's more getting to a traditional
run.
Yeah. Because at that point, you bring in Captain America and Nuke, who is a ridiculously comic book character.
Oh yeah.
Just looking at him, and their fight, it's very different from the fairly simple 2 gangsters try and kill Karen and her abusive lover that ends out the first 5 arcs.
Mm-hmm.
Like that action scene, it almost feels like it didn't need to be an action scene to end the book. It works, and it's good for that, that great splash of the 2 of them reunited and trying to get back to it. But then you have that huge fight with Nuke, where it's like, okay, this is getting back to being a comic book again.
It's back to being a superhero comic.
Yeah, superhero, yeah.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, for sure. But I mean, it works. It works for the story. Again, it is a superhero comic, so.
Yeah. I think it's important to have those elements. It's just really interesting to see the book get to be something so different in a time where it was maybe less expected to be so experimental.
Yeah. I mean, I think that this is the time when, like, it is such an 80s comic, I like we talk about it. It definitely is timeless, but this is kind of like, I mean, this is what Frank at this point in time when he made this book. This book is exactly what he had been, like, people had come to expect from him. This is what he made his career on. And like, there's just something. I mean, like, having Karen Page turn into a porn star who's addicted to heroin. That is such an 80s, like, dark thing. We did an episode of... actually, it was the previous episode. We talked about the Alan Moore book, Supreme. I don't know if you've read it, Jordan. I would really recommend it.
I have not. I will check that out just because Alan Moore.
Alan Moore, exactly. I mean, if for no other reason than Alan Moore. But I just love the joke. I'm not going to go into great detail. This is a podcast about Daredevil. But there's a joke where he does a pastiche of 80s type characters. And Supreme is a superhero, and in the 80s his girlfriend was a crack addict, junkie. Like, it's just all this, like, perfect pastiche. And you look at it and you're like, that's exactly Karen Page in this book. Like, it's like a 1-for-1 ratio. And I mean, it works for the story. I'm not saying it's a bad thing, but this is kind of what you were seeing in a lot of comics. But I think that in this book, it's done well, so it stands the test of time. Other books, not so much.
Yeah, I think it doesn't feel like... No, because I agree. I think it has very 80s elements to it. The one that I found less than timeless just because of how print media is going is J. Jonah Jameson's speech about the power of the newspaper.
Oh, yeah.
And I was just like, well, maybe not as much anymore because of apathy and where the media's gone, but I get what was happening in that scene. But it's not like when you read... And I like the Green Arrow run from the 80s. I have some trades of that, and I like it. But it's very 80s there, where he's fighting cocaine dealers and
his sidekick,
ripped from the headlines.
Yeah.
Plot.
Exactly. Yeah. Which, by the way, can I just say how much I love the character of J. Jonah Jameson? I've always loved that character. I'm a big Spider-Man reader myself, but I loved these scenes, the JJ scenes in this book specifically, because they just nail that type of tough guy newspaper editor. Like, he's sort of an antagonist in Spider-Man, but he's not like a bad guy, and he takes principled stands on things. I really liked him in this book, even though he's only in it for a few scenes, but he was good.
Yeah, it nails the character. Because one of the things I like, because when people write him badly, I think they have a tendency to villainize him a little too much.
I agree, yeah.
And make him almost a sniveling, subservient person to someone in power, which is exactly what his role is not. In this, he's like, no, Ben, don't be this guy.
Exactly.
Tell the story. That's one of the things I liked about Brand New Day, where he specifically, you know, they create a counterpoint in those Spider-Man stories, who is kind of that sniveling, all about the paparazzi, all about the, you know, sensationalist news, as opposed to J. Jonah, for all his faults, is a dyed-in-the-wool journalist.
Yes. Yeah, and he's just nailed perfectly in this book. I mean, I like all the Ben Ulrich scenes. Like, I like all the reporter stuff. It just plays to Frank Miller's film noir strengths, you know. But yeah, that was a good scene where he's getting chewed out by JJ for backing out of the story because the mafia threatened to kill him.
Yeah, it's one of the few times he gets to be heroic, because other times it's not. He's, again, I think you put it well, he's antagonistic, so it'll be like he knows that Ben knows Daredevil's identity, and so as a reporter, of course he wants to break that story, and maybe he gets a little too caught up in the story of it all to see why it would be important not to, but it's not like he's outright a bad guy.
Yeah. Maybe it's also just part of my personally, I like that sort of like moral ambiguity to a lot of characters. You know, people have good aspects and bad aspects.
Yeah, and I think that comes through in this story a lot, because what I found interesting is, because there is that whole Foggy and Glory hooking up thing that happens.
Yes.
But it doesn't feel crass.
Right.
Because I think what it does, it starts, they make sure, like Frank and David, they make sure it starts before the trial, that you start getting the hints. So then when they do some time skips, and it feels like it progresses naturally, not also tying in that Matt's going crazy and he starts accusing them of being duplicitous. It just gets to where it's like, you don't, it's still kind of a thing where it's like, that was your best friend's girlfriend, but at the same time, it doesn't feel like they're being, you know, bad people.
Right. Well, and I also really liked that aspect of the story too, because that feeds into Matt's paranoia and his dementia of like his life spiraling out of control. But that was not necessarily as the way I read it. I guess you could read the book, you could have multiple interpretations, but I feel like Foggy and Gloria getting together was not the result of the Kingpin, of him trying to ruin Matt's life. I think that was just purely coincidental happenstance, and that's again leading to this level of chaos. So there's just things going on that Matt has no control over, and he can't even tell what's the Kingpin's fault and what's not.
Yeah, I think because it's not like he just has that. He also doesn't trust Ben and gives him like that stony, hangs up on him phone call moment. Yeah. But on the other hand, the Kingpin does have that far reach. I mean, he does eventually, if only temporarily, break Ben and make him think that he's going to be silent.
He won't even say the name. He won't say the name. Matt,
so Matt's not entirely wrong, because Ben is one of probably the two people he, on a good day, can trust more than anyone else in the world. Yeah,
he's one of his most trusted confidants, for sure.
Yeah, so to see him break, it's not necessarily that... I mean, Ben doesn't want to break. I mean, it clearly tears him up. That he has to kind of buckle a little. But that does feed back into Matt's paranoia.
Well, and I think that's I agree with what you're saying. It's not even that, like, Foggy and Gloria is outside of the reach of the Kingpin. It's just that there's just this level of ambiguity, and that's what really drives Matt. Like, that's what really sends him up the walls, is that he just can't tell, like, reality anymore. Like, he just can't tell what's going on.
Yeah. Well, and a big part of that is because, again, there are those hints that, the Kingpin is going to get to everybody. He almost hires Foggy at one point and then decides to kill him. But, you know, no one is outside of the Kingpin's reach, is sort of the point of the story. There's that shot of him just sort of looking over the city in the early parts of the story, and it's just a case of, he kind of owns this place.
Well, yeah, I mean he's throughout the story he's calling in favors from politicians, a general, an army general. You know, that's how he gets a nuke in the first place.
Yeah,
Yeah, he kind of just becomes this representation of just like ultimate evil, like in like controlled evil, which is the scariest thing in the world. So
yeah,
I like this book, and there's a lot you could say. I think what we touched on this earlier, talking about Frank Miller setting the template for Daredevil. But I think what I like about Born Again is what I like about a lot of the types of books we talk about on this podcast, is that this book by itself is representative of the character and the mythology as a whole. And I think that's what makes it so timeless and why it works. Because you can read this book and pretty much like get like why people like Daredevil, or at least what Daredevil has become as the mythology was growing.
definitely. Just yeah,
So my question then, talking about this like this greater mythology, I have not watched the Daredevil TV show. I am not a big TV show watcher. Anybody who listened to our iZombie podcast may have heard me go off on a little bit of an embarrassing rant about the iZombie show compared to the comic. I kind of let my inner fan out for a second. I promise not to do that often. But so I haven't watched the Daredevil show at all, but I've heard good to mediocre things about it. Jordan, have you watched the show?
yeah. I've seen the first season a couple of times. I watched it with myself and then with a couple other
Mm-hmm.
people. And actually, in reading this, I rewatched the pilot just because a lot of what was in this story reminded me of the show. So
Okay.
I think this was definitely fundamental to the show.
Yeah, I was going to ask then. So yeah, how does the show compare to like Born Again?
I think what's interesting is it pulls from a lot of different Daredevil stories. I
Mhm.
mean, it features Karen Page not kind of before
Yeah,
all
certainly.
this, and it features different areas of things. But what it pulls from is the idea that the Kingpin is a great evil because he has his hands in everybody's business.
Mhm.
Like he knows everything about them, and the reason he hates Daredevil so much is that he's this icon that is he can't
Yeah,
get
you
him.
can't touch
And so
Daredevil.
that's what the focus of the season is it's their rivalry and the idea that the Kingpin is going to break. Like he starts off like when you first meet him in the show, he's very much like he is here.
Mhm.
Confident, in charge of everything. He's worked his way into every reach of government and local politics that without anyone noticing. He's sort of a figure in the shadows. And then the show sort of follows a similar path of Daredevil pushing his limits and bringing in just breaking him down. And I also think it follows that the thing that, you know, the role it fills in the Marvel Cinematic Universe is very similar to how this plays out, where it's very much its own thing, and there's not a lot of lip service paid to the larger Marvel Universe. It just stays its own beast and lets it be the story it needs to be to kind of adapt who Daredevil is. I reading this made me see a lot of that because this is fundamental Daredevil stuff, and I think the show captures it pretty well.
Well, that's good. That's good to hear. I plan on watching the show. Just haven't got around to it. I'm simultaneously too busy and too lazy to watch the show. But what you said about, I'm glad that the show follows suit to this story arc, which is it's not really tied to the greater continuity. It's sort of a little self-contained. Little nods here and there, they're fine, but keeping it kind of like in its own little Daredevil corner, I like that. And I think that's always been one of the greatest strengths of Daredevil as an ongoing series. I've kind of always maintained that Daredevil as a character probably has the best ratio of really good issues compared to really bad issues, probably better than any other character. And I think that the reason for that is because the book is just popular enough to keep selling and keep being in production, but not popular enough to have to constantly try to cash in on it with big crossovers and other stuff. So it's sort of like, it just kind of like walks that line. It's right in between where a lot of creators want to work on it, but there's not as much oversight as you would like on a Spider-Man or an X-Men book, where they're very, editors are very concerned about, how is this, we got to keep our numbers up, we got to maintain a certain level of sales, and we got to tie into, all this other stuff that's going on. Daredevil kind of gets away from that, and that's partially why I've always enjoyed reading a lot of Daredevil comics.
Yeah, what I've always enjoyed about him is kind of that, especially reading the runs I've read recently, is it uses the Marvel universe for flavor and lets him have friends that, if he needs them, he can roll with, but it never feels like he's beholden to anybody else.
Right.
He can have Spider-Man as a friend who shows up on occasion, but not because Spider-Man has had his, there's some big event where Spider-Man needs Daredevil to fight his villain or something like that. It's just because they're friends, and occasionally he's going to call on him.
Yeah, it works. It works very well. So I think I've certainly said everything that I can say about Daredevil Born Again. There maybe were a few other things if I were poked and prodded, but off the top of my head, I think we've pretty much covered anything about the book. Any final thoughts you want to share about the book?
What I'll say is the thing that most impresses me is just how, going back to it, we said it earlier, but it really is a timeless story that holds up remarkably well. I think it shows Frank Miller at his best, not getting negative, but in recent years he's come out under a lot of fire and a lot of criticism, especially with his recent works. But when he was on fire in the 80s, this is the sort of book he could produce, and it was, something special.
Absolutely. I mean, I agree with you about Frank Miller too. I pretty much, I don't even really like Sin City all that much. I think that's where he starts to get really, really off the deep end. But yeah, this early 80s stuff is just pure pro-rate stuff.
Yeah.
Well, that's good. Well, I think that'll about do it then for this episode. Good discussion. This was a really good episode. Thank you, Jordan, for being on the show.
Not a problem, man. It's a lot of fun. I always love talking comics. Yeah. And going in depth on a book is a lot of fun, especially one that was not entirely new to me, but was fresh to me.
Yeah. I mean, that's why I like doing this podcast. I mean, we've got some people that listen to it, and thank you everybody who's listening to this. But frankly, the biggest reason I do it is just an excuse to talk about comics with other people, because I don't hang out on message boards. I don't do a lot of that. So this is a great opportunity to do that, and I hope everybody enjoys listening to us wax on about whatever nonsense we're going on about. But so thanks for being on the show, Jordan. We'll go ahead and do our little roundup here. So my name is Aaron Walther. You guys can find comics that I have written on newhavencomics.com. You can also find some of my stuff on aaronwalther.com. You can find me on Facebook, Aaron Walther on Facebook, and you can find me on Twitter at AAWALTHER. That's at AA Walther on Twitter. And you can find new episodes of this very podcast, Comic DNA, at Podbean. It's on Podbean, but it's comicdna.podbean.com. And we're also on iTunes. You can search Comic DNA on iTunes. You'll find us on there. So, Jordan, I know you got that Kickstarter up. We'll put the link to that in the description. Where can people find any stuff that you want them to see on the internet?
Well, if you'd like to find more of my things, yes, there is the Kickstarter for Terminal Protocol. We have a Facebook page, facebook.com/Terminal Protocol. That's got all of our updates, and will eventually probably evolve into more updates just on my stuff in general. I'm on Twitter at IndigoMaster, ENDIGOMASTER. And if you want to hear me talk more about comics as well as video games and TV, thejoyofgaming.com is where all of our podcasts that I am a co-host of exist.
Sounds great. Well, I'll definitely have to check out some of those podcasts. Excuse me. So, yeah, that was great. I think that's going to do it for us. Jordan, thanks for being on the show. Everybody, thank you for listening. We'll see you all next time.